Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, a podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm an investigative journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are economists, scientists, politicians, academics, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and ecological crises that we face today, and they reveal their solutions to mitigate the damage to our future. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Hit the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. Before we get into the normal intro, this episode is called Journalism's Role in a Crisis, and it was recorded in January. Now, obviously, Russia invaded Ukraine yesterday, and there is no mention of that conflict or war in general throughout this episode. We were discussing more the general crisis that the world finds itself in, rather than the acute crisis facing Ukrainians. Today's guest is Pulitzer-prize winning journalist Ian Urbina. Ian spent 17 years with the New York Times, eventually becoming one of their lead investigative reporters, and his career took him to focus on the oceans, what he calls the final frontier. He investigates the intersection of environmental and human rights abuses. He left the New York Times in 2019 to set up his own project, the Outlaw Ocean Project, which essentially is a non-profit newsroom that provides investigative stories to media outlets all over the world using the exact same copy, which means the same story is getting read by hundreds of thousands of different people in different languages all around the world. And as a journalist, that's like really exciting. And we get into the theory of that. This episode was going to be about the oceans, but it kind of became more about the role of journalism during a critical time, the theory of journalism, and how journalism needs to adapt to be able to fulfill its role as a public educator. I so enjoyed speaking with Ian, and I hope you really enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. If you love the episode, do consider supporting Planet Critical on Patreon. Interview transcripts are now available for patrons. The link is in the description box below. A huge thank you to everyone who is already supporting the project. I greatly appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to speak with me today.
My pleasure.
It's very cool to have a Pulitzer-prize winning journalist on the show. Very, very, very cool. I'm a journalist myself, and I have had some incredible interviews with our ilk, let's say. But yeah, not a Pulitzer-prize winner yet, so thank you.
You'll be underwhelmed. Just brace yourself.
I'm gonna have to cut that bit out. Just for people that maybe haven't come across your work, can you give a brief overview of your career and how it was that you ended up, focusing on the oceans?
So I went to grad school from undergrad. I was in a doctoral program eventually in anthropology and history. And I was drawn to a sort of Jane Goodall fantasy of being out there in the yonder and seeing, capital F foreign things, really distant places that were exotic and different. And that was sort of the engine that drove me into anthropology. And then I left the academic realm because I wanted to do a different kind of writing for a different type of audience, but I still had a hankering to explore. And I began working on the Middle East for a couple of years, and then I got hired by the New York Times in a very lucky set of events, and was in a baptism by fire for several years, having never produced copy on deadline. And that was a painful experience. And yeah, I mean, I always aimed to do long form international investigative narrative magazine style journalism, and took me a while to get there. But finally, my last 10 years at the New York Times, I sort of had arrived and was doing that kind of stuff. And was responsible for producing either single big stories that take a while to produce or series. The second to last series that I did for the paper was a series that was meant to look at human rights and environmental abuses at sea around the world, called the Outlaw Ocean.
And that's since sort of become one of your main focuses, right? This final frontier.
Yeah, the main focus for me, I took 2 years off for a book project, went back out to sea, produced the book, then went back to the Times for a year to produce a series about bullets and ammunition, and then I found myself hankering to get back out offshore. So I left the Times, created a nonprofit journalism organization that just focuses on these sorts of stories.
Was it that you felt that you had to leave the Times in order to invest the amount of time that you wanted to into these stories, or did you think that you could do more having an independent nonprofit newsroom?
Both. The Times was incredible. I mean, it was a teaching hospital that took me in off the street and trained me to do this profession called journalism. And I have nothing but positive things to say about my 17 years there. At the same time, it's a big legacy organization. And number one, normally an investigative reporter needs to switch topics every 2 years
Hmm.
at longest. And I didn't want to switch topics. I thought after the book, there were so many amazing stories out there and so few journalists doing that kind of reporting that it was just too important an opportunity, too urgent a topic to not. But I also I wanted to do some weird, perhaps crazy things that I didn't think I could manage at the time, such as finding innovative, half-baked ways to distribute journalism differently, with help of music and podcasts and animation and, stage acting and, you know, art and other ways to do things with journalism that I thought would be fun, but also have a bigger social impact and get more people to consume the journalism. So I knew I had to sort of leave to do some of that stuff, but I also just wanted to continue reporting on this subject matter.
Let's talk about our trade because it's getting a pretty bad rap at the moment. People like to talk about the media, capital T, capital M, as if that means anything. And if you ask them to define that, they often go the corporate media, which means even less. What you've said there is essentially that, you wanted to try different mediums and to have a bigger impact. What is going wrong with our trade? Where could we be doing better to draw attention to these really, really critical stories? I mean, even the fact that you just said that an investigative reporter has to switch topics every 2 years. There's a sense of madness in there. I mean, surely the longer that you stay on something, you build your sources, you build your wealth of information, you become the expert.
Mm. Well, a couple of things. One, if you're a big institution like the New York Times and you have 15 full-time investigative reporters, but you have 50 worthy topics, you
Mm.
know, rape on campuses, Donald Trump, climate change, arms trafficking, slaughter in Sudan, and you name it, right? You, as the executive editor, in this case, Dean McKay, have to be smart about trying to spread the field with your players. And so, from a structural point of view, even at a paper like the New York Times that's invested a huge amount, probably more than most, if not all, in investigative, you have to move them around. So while there is merit, and you see that even at the New York Times, there's a famous reporter named Willie Rashbaum who's been on the same beat for I think 30 years, and it shows. He's got the best sources of anyone, and the relationships and sense of nuance. Peter Baker, the White House correspondent, same thing. He's been on that beat for 2 decades, and it shows. But at the same time, you kind of have to move certain other types of players around. So I actually get why there's this need to move investigative reporters around so that they don't become beat reporters. They're investigative reporters, so they parachute into things.
Mm.
So, at least in my own outlook, I get that. It doesn't mean I want to do it. And that's why I left. I decided I wanted to become a beat investigative reporter, and my beat was the 2/3 of the planet that's water. But I get why institutions need to do that. To your other questions, I actually think a lot of the legacy, or what you rightly laughingly called the corporate media, there's a lot that they're doing well. Because if you look at media as the self-created content that floods the internet, uh, Facebook,
Mm.
then the middling, weird, hybrid, duck-billed platypus content that's sort of low bar standards journalistically, but it's a step above self-created Facebook content, but it's not really vetted, edited, fact-checked content. That's that middle ground. Those two realms alone flood the internet with crappy stuff, that's not vetted. And then the corporate so-called media, the legacy outlets, are often the ones that are still clinging to certain standards of rigor, copy editing, fact checking, corrections, and so I kind of look at the Washington Post, the AP, the New York Times, the New Yorker, BBC, as doing an impressively good job in the midst of a wave of content and trying to survive from a market point of view and hold on to those standards and not become peddlers of misinformation. So when I look at these papers and read them, I think, wow, I really am proud of them for holding on to these costly, difficult standards, even if it means they get beat, because someone else moved the story faster and got things wrong and don't have to be held to account for it and these sorts of things. So I actually think there's a lot being done right. What I think is one of the shortfalls or blind spots of legacy outlets is if you think of we in our profession as makers of things, we make stories and we deliver content about the day's news, and that's our product. I think in terms of crafting of the product, there's a lot of interesting innovation happening. I think there's a lot less innovation in terms of how to distribute it. Legacy outlets have a sort of old school model where if you do it good enough, they'll come to you, they'll come to your restaurant. No, this is the time of delivering food. Like everything is delivered now. You got to go out to the customer. And a lot of legacy outlets are trying to make everyone come to them. And I think there's a anemia of innovation when it comes to distribution of journalism by partnering with other platforms, even Facebook, even these things that I sort of dismissively refer to as half-baked, factories. Those players can help us in delivering our better product if we figure out how to work with them, whether it's Spotify or YouTube or Facebook or whatever. And that's where I think there needs to be more innovation. That's one of the reasons that I love.
How do journalists identify the line between providing information and essentially taking on an educational role in society and then giving the public what they want? Because journalists, we're not experts. That's kind of what we do, right? We write about other experts. That's the idea. And to me, and what you're saying, I mean, I agree, but I would also counter with there seems to be a lack of innovation as well and kind of being more stringent with the demands of what a journalist's role is and what responsibility we have in choosing what information gets published, choosing what's most important, prioritizing that rather than thinking in terms of, okay, well, we have ad streams to support. So we're going to, float the clickbait and then allow kind of hope that other people come through the back channel to find sort of the worthy journalism. I mean, the amount of papers that are not investing in investigative reporting anymore because people don't want to read long form things. And it's like, well, if you continue to feed that feedback loop, it's only going to get worse. So what line do you take? I mean, we're not academics. We can't stand in front of a class and go, this is what you need to know.
Yeah. I mean, I love metaphors and half the time I peddle bad ones. So I might engage in that right now, but the metaphor I think of is a restaurant. So I think of where you have a restaurant owner and you have a chef, and the restaurant owner is thinking about the menu writ large and whether there's a variety of things on that menu. You got desserts, you got some junk food, you got some really high-end stuff. It's a mix that maybe the restaurant owner decides. And then the chef is supposed to make a lot of the stuff. And you have different types of chefs, the sous chefs and the dessert chefs. Okay. Just stop with my metaphor is to say in media, I kind of think you and I make stuff. You and I are the journalists, the chefs. And we have an obligation as the journalists to decide what we like making, what we value making, what we want to serve folks. And then we lean into that and hope we get hired at a restaurant. So if you're okay with making dessert or junk food, great. And there's a legitimate argument. People want junk food. People like it. I'm going to make it good and feed it to them. Okay. I'm a broccoli guy. I'm trying to make really healthy stuff and I'm going to keep doing that. And I'm going to look for jobs making really healthy food, sustainable food, etc. Okay. And then I think the the job of a Dean Baquet at the New York Times or David Remnick at the New Yorker or whatever, these restaurant owners, is they need to think about the full restaurant and how much junk food, dessert, and sustainable, healthy, good meals they should be putting out. And so I guess in my conception, I don't ever want to run the New York Times. Like I don't want to have to be deciding the restaurant menu and striking a balance between giving people what they want, keeping the doors and open and the lights on, ad revenue, and making sure my certain class of reporters are producing the broccoli meals. I don't want to be doing that. I just want to make broccoli meals. I want to make sustainable and then hope for the best. And that's why I left and made my own organization. If I can make an organization that has figured out a way, if the global landscape of consumers is young people in Taiwan and old people in the Netherlands and middle-aged folks in Washington, D.C., and I'm like trying to figure out how to get my meals to them, then I'm doing things that kind of break the mold of the BBC or the New Yorker or the Economist and sort of say, okay, I'm just delivering meals direct to customer. That's kind of where I am now, is I'm just going to focus on my meals. I know that there's a reason that there's a lot of junk food out there. I eat junk food. It's like, I'm not being high and mighty about all this. I do think there's too much junk food on the market when it comes to news, and there need to be more of our sort that are really trying to produce more of these meals and make them attractive and get them to people. But I also don't pass judgment on the restaurant owners who kind of have to figure things out. Sorry if that's long-winded. But
No. I get it. And I mean, ultimately, when you create something in a market that depends on that market and its consumers to have a sustainable model, and when I say sustainable there, I mean the fact that it won't go under, then, of course, you're going to have to, there's going to have to be somebody that thinks about all these different moving pieces. I just wonder if the world would be in a slightly different state today if journalism didn't rely on profits and therefore could dare to say what we don't want to hear. I want to question even that idea of what do people want? Because if we look at the data on mental health and what these sort of TikTok and Facebook algorithms are actually doing to us, yes, we're responding on some kind of neurochemical dopamine level, but it's not making us happy.
Right.
It's not actually something consciously we want. It's something we've kind of gotten stuck into. Thanks, Zuck.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think there is a obesity. Sorry, I'm
let's
really
keep
leaning
going.
into. There is an obesity epidemic, right? And junk food is bad. And I do agree with the Mayor Bloomberg of the world that sort of finds structural ways to de-incentivize the eating of bad stuff that makes us sick and unhealthy and costs society and has us die early. Yes, I completely agree with the point you're making. And I think you're exactly right too, that do people really want fatty foods, or is there a multi-billion-dollar market inculcating a taste for those things, both in the making of them in the products, but in the advertising of them and social engineering and all that stuff? Yes. So I completely agree. And I think you're right from a democratic point of view, from a, pandemic point of view, look at any issue of today, geopolitical point of view, the pervasiveness of informational junk food is really unhealthy and a big problem. So I hope our broccoli purveyors win.
I hope so too. Just a little anecdote. Literally 5 minutes before we jumped on, I received a kind of chain message on WhatsApp in one of the Malaysian groups I'm in, because I do a lot of my work over there. And it was one of these, it was a link to one of these middling how did you explain it? The middling sites that aren't fact checked.
Right, pseudo news. Right,
pseudo news, exactly. And it was called Breaking News, and it had the grainiest logo. And then there was they'd copied and pasted and put the Malay translation in the actual message, and it was about the fact that the COVID vaccine is not an actual vaccine, and that some case had been lost. Fauci and everybody else had lost a case in the Supreme Court that had been brought to them by scientists, and how essentially everybody has to stop taking the vaccine. There's a huge anti-vax sentiment over there as well, unsurprisingly. And I had to, I'm in a team of journalists. They're bright people, and they forwarded it to be like, what's going on with this? And I went, right, here's the fact check. You know, this same hoax circulated around in May. But I know for a fact that that is going to go sweeping through the Dayak, the Iba, and the indigenous populations who are already fearful of government because they've been abused for decades, if not centuries. And it's going to have a huge, horrible impact. And it's like, well, it's not God. And then there was that story. I'm going to have to cut this out. There's that story of that guy that killed his, 1 and 3-year-old kid because they thought that they had lizard blood in them. That Florida bloke,
Right. Yeah.
Something's got to get, surely something in our industry, it's got to change.
Yeah. No, look, I live 3 blocks from this pizza place that was the center of Pizzagate. Yeah, literally, it's where we get our pizza. That's where we live. This zip code has the largest concentration of journalists in the country. Washington Post lives right there. Page One, New York Times is over there. And we all live, and that's the place we all get. And you saw in that case, guys with guns showed up because they were convinced that there were pedophiles keeping kids in the basement of the pizza place, and it's complete. So yes, this has real world consequences all over the place. It's demoralizing. But the flip side is this. I watched Don't Look Up 2 nights ago. And I was like, okay, this made me happy in the way that The Big Short made me happy, in that this is an example of art and journalism melding in a really smart way that makes a narrative that's fictional, but not so much, like it's really clearly a riff on climate change and the idiocy of misinformation, but it's doing so in a narrative way that people will understand. And I'm like, okay, this is what change, where fiction combines with nonfiction in a positive way. And that's a huge success, that story. And it had huge stars and had flaws, I'm sure.
I mean, we have to, because there's one major flaw, and it actually directly affects you as well. So I'm glad we've gotten here. Leonardo fucking DiCaprio, right? He is not an environmentalist. He has made millions from 1MDB, from his friendship with Joe Low, in which billions was funneled out of Malaysia from cutting down Borneo's rainforest. Okay, we know that. He was cited in the DOJ. For whatever reason, in the DOJ, his name disappears after a couple of years. He has never repatriated that money to the Malaysian people. And he's in the climate change film. Come on!
All right, I'm going nowhere near this line of questioning. Not because I have self-interest, which I do 100%, but also because I'm clueless. Like I simply don't know.
I'm not. I can tell you
what you're referring to. Yeah, no, it sounds like. So off recording, I want you to school me on all you just said and slow that deck of cards down a little bit so I can see them. But yeah, I don't know shit about this. So
well,
I'm gonna leave it. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just gonna say I shouldn't go there because I don't know what I'm talking about.
Sure, don't go there. But just to clarify for people listening, he was one of the people that bought the rights to your book about the oceans, right?
Yeah, and again, I would say, like, mixed bag though the guy may be, he's put a lot of money behind a lot of ocean work, whether it's a PR.
Have you looked into how that money is structured?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it goes to huge multi-billion-dollar organizations, Oceana, WWF, which have deep flaws. Again, great. I totally agree. But anyway.
We can move past it. Let's talk about the Outlaw Ocean Project. Let's talking about some of these different ways that you're engaging audiences and you're getting narratives out there, and hopefully get into what you hope the future of journalism might be. But let's talk about the project.
What is it?
Yeah, what is it?
Yeah. So the Outlaw Ocean Project is a small journalistic nonprofit. We have a staff of 8-9 full-time folk. We produce stories about and usually reported from that 2/3 of the planet that's water. Our goal is to try to do stories out there that either aren't being done at all or we think could be done better or differently. And that typically are at the intersection of human rights and labor on one side and environmental on the other, so that we try to avoid having one of those two elements fall away, a purely environmental marine story or a purely human story. We try to really stay at the interactivity and intersection of those.
Great.
Yeah, and we also try to then take the stories and once they're done, disseminate them in a pretty different way. We self-fund them, and then because we own them, we can translate them into 10 languages and give them for free or at reduced rate to, huge number of venues around the world.
Right. Okay. So you're getting the message out a little bit further than most people because you're not in competition with these other publications. You can just sort of sell. You're like an environmental, human rights, outlandish press agency, almost investigative press agency.
I would say we're like ProPublica or the Marshall
Okay.
Project. This is who we modeled ourselves after. These are boutique outlets that don't have an organ. They make food, but they don't have a restaurant, and they don't want to own a restaurant. They're not trying to get folks to read it on their own website. If they do, great. But they make the stuff, they make it better, different than many staff reporters at the New Yorker or the New York Times might be able to do. We spend a year and a half on something, and then we take it and we say, hey, this is done or mostly done. Are you interested in it? If you are, you don't need to pay, or we'd be happy if you put in a small donation. But we're also going to maintain ownership over it, and so that you can run it exclusively for a week, 2 weeks. But then we're taking it back and we're going to translate it and we're going to run it in 50 countries in all these different languages. And we have partners all over the place that are really interested in that, and we're growing that grid all the time.
That's amazing. But then how do you make money if they don't have to pay for stories?
Leo DiCaprio. No, I mean, kidding. No, I mean, somewhat a joke, somewhat not. We are philanthropically funded. So we take money from not corporations, not governments, but large philanthropies. I'd say 60% of our current budget is singular big grants from philanthropies that are invested in journalism. And again, we modeled after ProPublica and Marshall Project, again, run by former Times folks that I know well and took guidance from. But we have a real firewall so that our funders have no say. They don't even know what the stories are before we publish them, but they have no
cool.
say at all. They just fund us to do the journalism. And then the other 40% comes from individuals, small subscribers who want to pay something to support the work we're doing. And so they pay $5 a month or $2 a month or $100 a month, depending on what they want and feel. And as we publish in all these different places, we just published in Le Monde yesterday, this big Libya piece. So I think we're up to about 55 countries, 10 languages. People see the stuff, they click on the website, they say, oh, wow, this is really impressive. And they decide that they want to support in some small way. And that adds up eventually. We're still small. I mean, we would love to have double the number of staff because we could produce double the number of stories. But we're growing. We're only 24 months old.
I noticed when I read your story on seabed mining, I noticed at the end, all the different places that it's in. And I saw, the Scottish Herald, which I found surprising. And I clicked on it and it was the exact same copy as well. Like they didn't change it up. They didn't make it a little bit more tabloidy. They didn't try to dumb it down. And I was very surprised. Is that one of the deals that you have with people? When they take it, they have to take it as is?
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of, so our rules are that there are several rules. And one of them is you can't touch the copy except if we approve it. So if they say, we love this piece, but we wanted to have a new headline and we need to cut 400 words, we say, okay, we'll cut the 400 words. You propose the headline, we'll approve. Or, hey, we love this, like with the New Yorker piece, it's a 10,000 word story. A lot of venues can't handle that length story. So we knew that was going to be a problem. So we made several versions. We made an 8,000 word story, and then we made a serialized version, a 4-part series. And we said, hey, we've got lots of different versions that we want to offer you. And then we had 7 or 8 spin-off pieces that were 1,500 words. that refer back to the original investigation. Okay, if you can't run the original, then could you run this? And so then we prepare this whole slate of things and different models of the same reporting, and then we go out and we build these relationships. But we say you cannot edit the story unless we approve it. And some places, again, when you're translating from Arabic to Chinese, or there are certain words that just don't make sense, and so we have translators on staff that just vet that stuff. But and our view is, we're dealing with partners who are, state organs. These are sketchy outlets. We don't care. Like, so long as they run our copy, that's what we care about. If they want to run it on their platform because they have their own interests, the Russians like this piece because it's hitting the Ukrainians, or, the Spanish like this because it's okay. Well, that's their deal. We're not going to write a story that's meant to be a hit job and fit within a certain model. Lots of people are going to like certain pieces of the story for certain reasons. Morocco and Algeria love the Libya story. Why? Because it bangs Libya, and it brings attention away from their abuses. We'll come for them too, in due time.
I find it fascinating because I think one of the issues with how information is disseminated, despite the fact that the world is so globally connected, is that people don't know. There's no sort of universal news. There's no universal media. People on one side of the world don't know what's happening on another. And certainly for these big global topics like, the economy or economic frameworks and systems, or climate change, or, the energy crisis, there's no one singular message kind of going out in all these different countries. So I find it very, very interesting what you're doing. And I really look forward to seeing the results, if it has an impact on kind of joining dots and then linking up people who are interested in these kinds of things across the world as well.
Well, I appreciate it.
Yeah, spreading universal's the wrong word, but making sure that people all around the world have access to the exact same information. I think that's a pretty modern and still very, very rare thing.
I think that's right. No, I think that's right. I mean, one of the things I'm really interested to look at is whether, like, this year we're going to take a really good look at radio in Latin America and Africa, because I have this sense that what you and the realm where you and I live, in the realm of words in Western media on the internet, it's insanely overcrowded. But if you just take a couple steps off the beaten path, there's informational grids that are far less trafficked, and you can access a lot of people that matter through those grids because they consume their news there. And radio, to me, feels like one example. Spotify as a platform, a non-news platform that a lot of young people are on, is another example of, like, well, who says it can't be a news platform? What if we package our stuff in music, but it's news, and we then get to young people through Spotify? That was one pivot. Another pivot is, well, who says that a lot of people in the world don't listen to radio? And those places have websites. They need content.
Yeah.
And if we get them the written content, maybe we can also get them audio. And all of a sudden, we're tapping into a huge market. We just got to build the infrastructure. But I think the key is, a lot of us, you and me, are really focused on this one terrain, and it's really competitive and overwhelmed. And the same editors at the BBC and the Economist and the Washington Post are getting 1,000 emails per week from freelancers. And it's like, okay, stop hitting them. Let's find folks that have as big or bigger readership. And then there's alternate things like Apple News. It's not a news platform, but it has huge news consequences, right? And so, like, figuring out where the nodes of news aggregators are, and figuring out how you can get your content to them without going through the traditional legacy means, like publishing in the Washington Post so as to get on Apple News. What if you just went straight to Apple News and said, so I'm trying to find landscape innovation that allows to get our stuff to bigger audience.
I guess another danger with that model then, right, would be, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, Like, it's fine. There's an element of, if I go to the Washington Post or the New York Times, generally speaking, I'm gonna trust. What am I gonna trust?
Mm.
I'm gonna definitely trust the information. I'm gonna definitely trust the legality. I might not always trust the intention or whatever. But there's a reputation that serves as a boundary,
Mm-hmm.
which means that I can quote that and it's correct essentially. Um, for someone like you, if somebody were to Google you, they go, "Oh wow, okay, well it's this Pulitzer-prize winning guy, 17 years at the New York Times. I can trust what he puts out into the world." Now, does that mean that kind of, social capital is going to start coalescing, or like reputational capital is going to start coalescing around specific people rather than institutions?
Mm-hmm.
And then what
Mm-hmm.
happens when those people retire or leave or,
Mm-hmm.
flip and start to use it for their own agenda as well?
Mm-hmm.
It is, there is the potential to, yes, reach more people and be very, very modern and very, very innovative. But it's also like you remove that barrier and you're letting in a lot of potential dangers as well and loopholes
Yeah.
for exploitation. And as
Yeah.
long as we don't have kind of like an international like union of there are unions of journalists, but like an international one or an
Mm-hmm.
international God, even an international legislative body, am I right?
Right.
Um, how do we ensure that we're not essentially just opening the floodgates for more fake news?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that the way I view that question pertaining to me specifically is, um, you much like ProPublica started as 3 people and now is 300 or whatever it is,
Mm,
and the brand ProPublica became an independent, trustworthy brand, but it started somewhere. Similarly, the Outlaw Ocean Project is starting with one guy and his team around him, but eventually, and we're already trying to do things to move that away from Ian, the person, and into the brand that is this organization as having a track record of producing stuff that appears in lots of different venues. And that kind of doesn't matter. But the stuff that they produce holds itself to a certain standard journalistically. And that's why they have a whole track record of getting published in these vetted old legacy outlet, institutions,
mm,
because they produce legit stuff, that follow the rules. Right.
yeah.
And so that's the hope here. I don't want a vanity institution that's built around me. I am trying to use my track record to build the foundation of the institution, but then really the institution itself should have the reputation as abiding by certain standards. And then when you see something's been produced by that institution, it doesn't matter where it got run because it probably got run a million places.
What I like about that is essentially you're creating a symbiotic relationship. And if there's one message of people that come on this podcast, all the scientists and the academics, it's that the solutions are not simple. The solutions are multifaceted, whether it's for the energy, economic, ecological crises. There's not just one blanket thing that we can do that's going to fix everything, like EVs or, renewables.
Mhm,
So the
mhm,
question of the media, what I like about what you just said is you're essentially showing how legacy institutions and new media can work together to fulfill a kind of, how do I put that? Fulfill a role that the other can't, but cannot exist without the other as well,
mhm,
rather than being
mhm.
in direct competition.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you summed it up perfectly. I don't think that we're meant to be adversarial.
Hmm.
My existence isn't meant to signal the end of legacy outlets. I think there is a lot of challenges that legacy media is facing, and we're probably going to see a consolidation more than we already have of which ones are left standing. But I really think they play an important role. And my hope is that they're open enough to partner more and more with the likes of, ProPublica, the Marshall
Hmm.
Project, my organization, uh, if we can comply with their needs. But it's a growing process. Like even getting these outlets to agree to the terms of not owning the content, that's a big,
Hmm.
big
Yeah.
hurdle to cross because they don't like that. But, people I think are evolving, the people in those decision-making positions.
Well, especially with investigative reporting, the amount of time it takes, as you said, years sometimes to uncover a good story and get everything in place.
Right.
It's kind of worth handing over the rights, or rather, forsaking the rights of a story if somebody comes to you with all that work done, I would imagine. I would hope.
Yeah. Yeah, and the marketplace makes it competitive because I think they know that, like, okay, well, if we don't bend on this, he's gonna take this to another venue, and then, we're gonna be in a if it does when we read it and, "Wow, this is pretty impressive," it's gonna get traction,
Yeah.
and so then everyone's gonna be running a story that we didn't run and we can't match, so we kinda look like we didn't get invited to the party.
Mm,
So I think there is gonna be market pressure. If this model succeeds, then
mm.
that's how it should work.
Excellent. Now, I have to ask you because if any of my listeners Google you, these are kind of the first things that are popping up at the moment because these articles were produced in December. But there
Mm,
was something that happened with musical artists and one of those projects,
mhm.
and you're in. I couldn't. I mean, I read the Rolling Stones. It wasn't particularly clear. Is there some sort of legal dispute over royalties and rights happening right now, or is the Outlaw Ocean Project managing to put that behind you quickly?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this does harken back to your original points about dangerous misinformation and sort
Mm,
of, the middling peddlers of really poor journalism. I mean,
mm,
I won't go down that rabbit hole too far, but it is a really illustrative example of, um the potential for really, really skewed and inaccurate things to get taken up by um, semi-branded institutions and
mm,
peddled and echoed. All that is to say, the basics of that are the music project has about 505 musicians from around the world, 60 countries that have signed on. And the mission of that is the musicians make music, around and using sound samples from the stories as a way to try to get more attention onto the stories and get the stories onto platforms like Spotify. Um, and, at root, there have been a dozen to 2 dozen musicians who were not happy with the project. Not for all illegitimate reasons, for some good reasons. Poor communication, anemic streaming, sort of dropped balls.
mm,
So in those ways, a real lesson learned by me and my staff who run the music project of ways we should improve and should have improved earlier. Um, Several of those musicians were very vocal and sort of were able to sort of get a lot of coverage on their frustrations. And again, what we tried to do is almost sort of Ted Lasso it. What
mhm,
would Ted Lasso do as
mm,
okay, hear them out, um, figure out what feels fair and what doesn't feel fair, focus on the things that feel fair and try to fix them in a
mm,
really open way. And so that's essentially what we did. We heard them out. We discerned from fair from unfair. We looked at the fair critiques, which were, hey, we want, more ownership over the streaming revenue and the rights of our music. Hey, we're not happy with how this music is doing and we want to pull out, these sorts of things. And we said, okay, our goal here is to disseminate the journalism. It's never been to make money. And in fact, we've only lost money on the music
mm,
project ever, but it's still worth it because it gets a lot of attention on the stories. And so we said, okay, here's how we can give you the fair things that you're asking for. We're going to shift the streaming revenue so that none of the streaming revenue comes to us, 100% goes to you. Done. We're going to offer you the right to pull your music down and then take it someplace else and own it outright and publish it anew.
mm,
Done. We're going to, if you want to stay in the project but keep your streaming revenue, we're going to make that really easy. Here's the form. We're also going to switch our service provider so that the people that are supposed to be getting you information about your streaming information and your royalties are more responsive. That's our responsibility. So if they screw up, it's on us. Our last service provider wasn't great, so we switched providers. Done. So and then we're going to formally apologize for the things we did wrong. Done. And then we're going to let the dust settle and see what folks have to say at that point. And that worked. we went from having 505 musicians to we now have 430. The 430 decided to stay, said we're really happy, and especially with those changes, but even before we were happy, we want to stay in the project. And the dust has settled, and now we're, moving forward. So that's that story.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. I think it's really helpful for anybody that has the misfortune of reading through those extremely long Rolling Stones article. Now, I have one final question for you before we go. Much as Carl platformed you, who would you like to platform?
Let me think carefully about that. Who would make for a great? Who does great work is one question. Who does great work that would make a great interview is a subset question. And I think you're asking the subset question, right?
Well, both.
Well, who does great work in my space? Um, uh, you know, the Global Fishing Watch is an organization that is really unusual, and they leverage satellites to lay eyes on bad stuff happening on the sea around the world.
Right.
Really inspiring and unusual. And then there's another organization called TMT, which is obscure and no one's ever heard of it. But the guy that runs it, a guy named Duncan Copeland, it's an investigative firm, and they do amazing work, and they're very quiet, but they're extremely effective at finding stuff happening on the oceans that no one else knows about. And I rely on them a lot. Who makes for a great interview? There's a guy named Bren Smith who does really good work. He's a fisherman, career fisherman, and he now calls himself a fish farmer. And
Okay.
he switched from chasing fish to growing kelp and other sustainable seafood. And he's just so interesting and smart and plain spoken and experienced, and he is a great interview. I've been on shows with him before, and he's poetic.
What was his name?
Bren Smith, and I'll email you his info.
That would be fantastic. Ian, it has been such a pleasure to speak with you. I really appreciate you giving me the time.
My pleasure. And again, if there's anything we can do collaboratively in the future, please keep in touch. I'd love to work with you again.
Oh, well, do you know what? I was going to stop this record button and ask that same question. So let's get right to it. If you want to learn more about Ian's work, I've put links to the Outlaw Ocean Project in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel and to share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon. A huge thanks to the Planet Critical patrons. This work wouldn't be possible without you. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.